Hi everyone, welcome to today's seminar. My name's Rob. I've been around debating for a little while now. And today we're going to look at British Parliamentary debating, but specifically looking at strategy and how to approach BP debating, I guess in a more critical sense. So, what will we cover today? We're going to look at tips and approach to think critically and strategically about BP debating. For experienced BP debaters, a lot of this stuff may seem a bit obvious because it's stuff you pick up and learn over time. But for newer BP debaters, I think it's actually really important for just getting a handle on how to actually think about BP debates and what your roles are and what things might look like, and hopefully give you an understanding about BP from more than just a general role fulfillment level. So for everyone here, has anyone here not done BP before? Okay, so we'll do a quick once over on BP debating as well. We don't have time to go through, like, I guess, the whole hour shebang, but we'll give you an overview, hopefully make it understood. The other thing about this presentation is there is a lot in this content, in this presentation, so you don't have to remember everything we say after the end of this, but it will sink in over time the more you do BP debating. And it won't necessarily win you every debate. There's a lot of things you do in debating that are like the basics, you build up, rote learning into yourself. It won't win you every debate, because I guess if you execute every strategy perfectly, all four teams are, equal opposite. I don't know what the metaphor is here, they can't beat each other if they're perfect. But it is a good way to start thinking about debating. The more you get used to the strategies, the more you get used to the basics, that then helps you build up so you can start winning debates by being a bit tricky or whatever. But it'll hopefully give you the starting point and a good place to build off. All right, let's start with a bit of a basic recap of BP debating though. So the people who haven't done BP before, have you done like general 3-on-3 or world schools debating before, or two-team debating? Yeah, okay. So it's a little bit similar to that, but also completely different. So in a BP debate, there are four teams, two teams on side affirmative, which we call government, and two teams on side opposition that we call, the side negative that we call opposition. And then you've got your opening and your closing halves. The top half, and there are two speakers on each team. The top half debate, so opening government versus opening opposition, is basically the same as a normal 3-on-3 world school, whatever debate format you're doing. If your first speaker supports the motion, advances models and arguments, op leader supports their case and explains why they oppose it, deputy prime minister and deputy opposition leader do the role of second speakers. And it's all parliamentary language, so your opening government has a prime minister and a deputy prime minister, OO has an opposition leader and a deputy opposition leader, they're just first and second speakers. Where it gets more complicated is in the closing half, so the closing two teams, closing government and closing opposition. Their role is to bring extensions to the debate, and an extension is a new contribution that the opening hasn't already brought. So what they're trying to do is, if you think of it like Labor and, Liberals and Nationals are in a coalition, but they have different reasons for supporting the same policies, it's kind of the same thing here. So the closing half would say, we also think we should do X, but we should do it for these reasons. And then what you're trying to do as closing half is prove why your reasons are the best reasons in the debate to support or to oppose the motion. We'll talk a little bit more about extensions later in this presentation as well, but they're basically you just got to give new arguments in the extension speeches. And the speakers in those teams are called your government member and your opposition member. They deliver the extensions. Then your two last speakers, the government whip and the opposition whip, are kind of like your third speakers. They give the summary and they explain why your team has won the debate. The other thing about BP is you have points of information. So points of information are where you have the opportunity to ask a question of a speaker on the other team. So you can stand up, say point of information. The speaker who's speaking has the right to accept or decline your point of information. If they accept you, you've got 15 seconds then to ask your question, and then the speaker can take however long they want to answer it, but ideally should be no more than 30 seconds of your own speaking time. If you don't want to set the POI, you can just say no, sit down, or just wave them down. And then they can't say anything other than that. So you can only say like point or information or whatever to get the speaker's attention, but you can't ask anything until you are accepted to give that question. And those POIs can happen after the first minute, but before the last minute of your speech. And 3 POIs should be taken per team. And POIs can be offered every 15 seconds after the first minute, but before the last minute of a speech. So that is a very, very brief basic overview of BP debating. I promise it'll make more sense once you've seen a debate and been in it once. But are there any questions before we go on about how basics of BP work? All right, I promise once we see a debate, it will make a lot more sense. Let's get into some strategy then. So the role of the opening half, this is actually a bit more detailed stuff on the introduction to BP as we were talking about earlier. It's the same as 3-on-3 to some extent, but it's just going to go over to revision because it will also help us establish the stuff we're about to talk about with regards to strategy. So with your Prime Minister, your job, you have a few things you need to do in your speech. You need to identify what the imperative of the debate is, why you're having it, what the problem is, what your model or your setup is that fixes that problem, and then identifying how that model fixes that problem, then looking at principal arguments and practical arguments. Your opposition leader, same sort of thing as normal. They identify a position that the team is taking with all their stance. So do they think there's no problem? Do they think there's a problem but the model makes the problem worse? Or do they have a counter model to say, yeah, we agree there's a problem, we agree it needs to be fixed, we can fix it better than you can. Then identify reasons why that stance is better than the model, and they go on to rebuttal, principles, and practical arguments. With rebuttal, it's always important here to prioritize case over rebuttal because you only have 7 minutes to speak, which is not a lot of time, so you need to be thinking more about getting the case out and leave rebuttal to later. Your Deputy Prime Minister and your Deputy Opposition Leader just do rebuttal and do arguments. So that's the basics of how those features should work. Let's get a little bit more technical. How can you approach your opening half? So there are 2 broad strategies for approaching an opening half of a debate. The first is called a scorched earth approach. I have not seen this film, but it was the first thing that came up in Google Images when I Googled it, and it's got Gina Carano on it, and when she's not saying questionable things, she's not a bad actress, and a wrestler. So, scorched earth, what does that mean? That is where you run as many points as you can, so you try and steal all the material in the debate for your side and run all the important and all the good arguments. The benefit of this is that if you run every argument in a debate, your closing half team doesn't have much to say because you've said all the things they have to say and they're going to struggle to come up with a new argument or a new approach to take to the debate. The problem with this strategy, however, is that sometimes you try and cover too much ground. You don't actually have the time to go into detail to prove those things. So you could spend 35, 40 seconds on 7 arguments each, but that's not really enough time to properly, fully explain that argument, which means your closing can then pick 1 or 2 of those things, explain them a lot better, and beat you in the debate. So that's the thing I should mention about BP debating structure in general for people who are new. The way the result is announced is you get ranked between the 4 teams. So the first ranked team gets 3 points, second ranked team gets 2, the third ranked team gets 1 point, and the fourth ranked team gets 0 points, also known as the donut. So if you scorch the earth and run everything very badly, your closing half team will probably take the 1 or 2 really important things, prove them a lot better, and win the debate. So when do you use this strategy? The best time to use a scorched earth strategy is when there aren't that many arguments in a debate. So when a debate is quite shallow because it doesn't go deep enough to reach the closing. And if you can run all the big arguments in a shallow debate, that does make it a lot harder for your closing half to come up with arguments. So try and think about, all right, there's not much to say in this debate, let's run these couple of things, we'll win it on this. Let's look at the second argument, second type of approach, which is the deep dive. I, again, have not read this book. So what is a deep dive? A deep dive is when you pick 1, 2, or 3 ideas, probably 1 or 2, and you go really deep on them. So you spend 2, 3, 4 minutes fully analysing every facet of this argument. The benefit of this argument is that it's really hard for closing teams to beat that argument or to expand on that argument because you've done all the work and you've done all the detail. But the con of this argument is you're kind of baking all your cake with the one flour. I think I've really structured that metaphor of putting all your eggs in one basket, right? So if your argument gets rebutted or outweighed, it's hard for you to place highly there because that is your whole case that is gone and you're left trying to gain points based on your rebuttal or your setup or things like that, which makes it a bit harder. So when do you use a deep dive strategy at opening half? You should use this when there are a lot of arguments for your side, and there's too many for you to cover them all effectively, so you narrow your focus to just a couple of things and you try and win them. Or it's when you have a really cracker idea that you think can win a debate on its own. And I generally think, I tend to lean towards more of a deep dive approach to closing half as a general starting point in most debates. And I think Brendan, who's here as well, I think is a really good advocate of the strategy of you pick the one most important thing at opening half that you're going to win the debate on, and you really explain not just that you prove it, but then you explain why it is such an important thing in the debate and why it has to win the debate. We'll go more into that bit about why it wins the debate a bit later, but I think as a general rule of thumb, probably better to err on the side of deep diving than scorching the earth. But again, it depends on the motion, depends on the situation you're in, and depends on the arguments you have as well. So that's the 2 main approaches. Do everything or do something specifically and do it well. What's that Ron Swanson quote? Don't half-ass 2 things, whole-ass 1 thing. That's, I guess, the kind of distinction between these 2. Let's talk a bit more about deputy strategy. I'm not going to talk about leader strategy in today's debate because that strategy is just give the case. There's not a whole lot more to think about with regards to a leader speech other than giving the case. So when it comes to your deputy speakers, they are quite similar to second speakers in 3-on-3 insofar as they need to do a couple of things. One, they need to pivot the case to respond to the other side. So if you're the Deputy Prime Minister and the opposition leader is given a speech that is not what you're expecting, if it doesn't quite match the debate you planned, or doesn't match the case that you planned, or just knocks the fuck out of your case, your job then is to try and pivot your case around to refocus the debate on what it has actually become. So either responding to correcting mistakes in your opening, or trying to win the ground back to your side of the debate. The second thing, your job you need to do is defend or rebut the material from your leader speaker, from your first speaker, so explain why it still wins the debate. And the third thing is you want to advance your case with new material. So what you'll hear a lot of is deputy speakers, particularly deputy opposition leader, backloading their case, which is a term that means putting the good arguments later so they can't be rebutted as effectively by the other side. I think this strategy is just silly, and if the argument is good enough, it will win, whether it comes out of a leader or a deputy. But if you have a third really good argument you want to run but can't fit it in the 6 or 7 minutes you've got in your leader speech, you can run it at second, and it's a good way to also try and steal extension material by running a new concrete piece of argumentation at your second speech. And that's a good thing for member speakers or the closing half teams to keep an eye out for, because sometimes you'll just write off the deputy speech, they're just going to do a rebuttal, I'm just going to write on my speech. But you've got to be listening to them in case they say the thing that steals your extension. Let's talk about specific BP stuff though, with regards to the deputy strategy. It obviously depends a bit on the approach you're taking, scorching the earth or going deep, but your main job here is to also cheerlead what your opening has said. So defend it, impact it, why does it matter, why is it important, and then weigh it. Why is it more important or better than something else in the debate? Why should we care about it a lot? So that's I guess the cheerleading when you're taking a deep dive approach. You might also want to spread, which is where you run lots of new material, or you might want to rebut, which is just focus entirely on taking down the other team. Obviously, rebuttal is a core element, whatever strategy you approach, but sometimes you might just say, no, I'm going to spend the whole 7 minutes rebutting, and in your case. When might we use each of these? I meant to take out the note that told me it was an interactive exercise, but I left it in there, so let's do an interactive exercise. When do we think it might be important to run this more cheerleader approach at deputy? Any thoughts? Jess, was that a hand or an apple?
Definitely an apple.
All right, never mind. So I think there are two. Oh, Brett, yes.
Yes. So if the other team has spent a good chunk of their speech, kind of taking down your material, and you think that it's still really good, and you just want to add extra stuff to it to make sure it stands at the end of the opening half, then you choose it.
Yes, exactly. So what Bree said there, in case it didn't come through on the audio here, is if the other team's really taken down your case, but you still think it's debate winning, you spend the time to rebuild it, defend it, and add to it and explain why it beats out that rebuttal. So yep, absolutely do that when you're cheerleading, and you also do it when you want to make sure that you are selling the judge on why this thing is debate winning. So if you're worried about your closing half, or if you've taken a real specific approach. Excellent. All right, when would you want to spread in the debate? Chris?
Well, there's not a lot of depth to it, so you think you can hit any big and worthwhile arguments and
yeah.
let the other team access them.
Absolutely. So Chris is exactly right. When you're doing more of a scorched earth approach, when you've got other arguments that you want to hit because you think the debate's shallow and you can take it all, you want to take that approach a second. It can also be useful as well if the other side hasn't done that good a job at rebutting you and you don't have to spend a whole lot of time defending. You can just say they didn't rebut, it stands. Here's a new thing. So you have that freedom now to add more because it hasn't been rebutted. Obviously there's a risk the closing half will rebut it, but you can have a little bit more flexibility there to bring in new material. And when might you do the rebuttal strategy? Where it's just 7 minutes of just pure attack.
When you run out of arguments.
Yeah, Jess is right. When you've got nothing else to say, it is a totally legitimate strategy. Just be no, we're going to rebut this and knock them out of the debate. You might do it, I guess, also in kind of a similar situation to what Bree identified, where the other team has really destroyed your case, but you can't fix it, where it's just gone. You might just want to go on the attack and try and gain some points or some weighing in that area, or where it hasn't been engaged with, you want to rebut it. So I think the next slide, yeah. Oh, I didn't put the GIF on both slides. Sorry about that. So yeah, that I think that's covered what we said. Is anything there that we didn't do? All right, and then how do you know what to do? Unfortunately, there's not just X plus Y equals this approach. Formula you can use is a bit based on vibes, a bit based on experience, and a bit based on good luck of what you think is going to happen. But it is good to be thinking about like consciously what approach you're taking, so you know what you're doing in your speech and can fully commit to it as well. And also having these like names to strategies in your head will also help you when you're a bit lost, don't know what to do. You'll be like, it gives you sort of a structure or an approach to take into advancing it. So that's how I think about deputy speaker. It's going to be a bit on the fly, but it can be a bit of fun. Any questions on deputies? All right, let's look at POI strategy for the opening half then. So as I said earlier, points of information, questions you get to ask. You're allowed to ask them every 15 seconds, so keep asking them. Obviously, you shouldn't badger the other side. You shouldn't be an asshole. You shouldn't be a dick. You shouldn't try and like abuse the other side. Particularly if you've got a speaker who's like nervous or new, don't like crush them with the POI manner. But you are legally allowed to ask POIs every 15 seconds. And if a speaker's like, I will not accept any POIs, don't offer them to me, don't listen to them. You are allowed to keep offering them, and you should, because judges do assess you based on your contribution. So if you don't ask any POIs, that could be a black mark on you in a tight clash because you haven't demonstrated a willingness to engage. So you should keep asking POIs. So during the top half, what should you be doing with your POIs? The first objective is you should take 1 to 2 POIs from your diagonal closing. So if you're opening government, try and take 1 to 2 POIs from closing opposition. Why do you take POIs from your diagonal closing? All right, the reason is because you don't get to directly rebut them, because you don't have a speech that follows them. So you want to make sure you're trying to get the extension out of them early and showing that you're engaging with them and showing that you're attacking them. Or if they don't give up their extension to POI, they might give up how they're going to rebut to your case, and you can pre-defeat that rebuttal already. So it's really important to engage with them, because unlike opening opposition, if we're still using the opening government example, you don't have a speaker that comes after and you just engage with them. So always try and take from your diagonal closing. Oh, sorry, the answer to that question was already on the slide. That's why no one said anything. The last thing to note with POIs is a thing called points of clarification. And these are generally asked in the first, straight away in the Prime Minister Opposition Leader's speech, and you should always take a point of clarification from the other side, because that could mean you've stuffed up your model, you've made something particularly unclear, or you've just forgotten something, and there's an opportunity for you to clarify a hole or a question in your speech. That's also particularly important because if the other teams picked it up, maybe the judges picked up that too and doesn't know what's going on, and if you don't answer that question, everyone's confused with your whole speech, and it could could hurt your case. So always accept a point of clarification. Sometimes a team will be like disguising a point of information as a point of clarification. They're being a dick if they're doing that. So that was more of a point of information, a point of clarification. Answer it and then move on. Because points of clarification, there's no hard and fast rule on this. They don't technically count as a point of information for counting in your speech. Most judges don't care. But you call out and say this is not a clarification, it's actually a point of information, and then you answer it. You probably don't need to take more than 1 point of clarification unless something has truly gone very wrong. Okay? So just take the first one whenever it's offered. During the closing half, what you should be doing with your POIs as an opening half team, you have 2 things you can do. You should be responding, so looking at what the closing half extension is and trying to rebut it, and that's particularly useful if the closing half is really good. You want to try and have a crack at attacking them, so you get some credit in the judge's mind for having a go at responding, having a go at engaging with them. The second thing you might want to do is inject your own material. So that is bringing your material back in the debate. Because closing half teams, they don't want to talk about the opening half. It's over, it's done. As far as they're concerned, we don't care. We want to make it about us and our closing half teams. So it's really important that you get back in there and go, no, hang on. We said this. What about this? And you try and show how your material is relevant or responds to that part of the debate. And it's every bit as about attacking the team as it is approaching the judge as well, because you want the judge to remember this happened. So it's recently in the judge's mind, and you can also try and force them to engage with what you said. So that's a general approach to how you should be looking at POIs when you're an opening half team. Any questions on that side of things? All right, let's go to looking at prep time then. So, I don't know what a bomb spaghetti is, but it comes up when you Google 15-minute bomb timer. So 15 minutes is not a whole lot of time in a debate in prep. It's actually really short. The benefit is though, once you do 6 months of BP and then you go back to 3-on-3, you're like, oh, half an hour, luxury. I don't know what to do with this time. But then in 6 months you forget how much time you have and you get up back to be like, oh no, it's so short again. But the thing that basically is, it doesn't change very much around how you approach prep. You just have to do it a hell of a lot quicker. So as a rough timeline, the first 2 minutes or the time you spend walking to the debate venue should just be your silent brainstorming of all your ideas. You then spend the next 3 to 10 minutes downloading and discussing the case, the strategy, the approach, the arguments. You should, unfortunately, give up any illusions that you'll be able to fully write out a speech in prep time, no matter what position you're speaking in. You get close to opening government, but really you don't have a whole lot of time. What's more important is that you and your teammate are on the same page about what the arguments are, what the mechanisms are, and have something fleshed out in terms of a structure and reason, and then you fill in the blanks as you go on the fly. It's actually a really good skill to develop, but it's important that your deputy knows what you're going to say at leader and vice versa. And then whatever time is left over, that's what you use for writing your speech, writing the leader's speech specifically. Deputies, you don't get to write your speech in the room, you have to write it on the bench. Sorry, sucks to be you, but that's what you got to do. So prep time, you've got to be snappy, and you've got to think, you've got to talk a lot. I find I talk a lot more in BP preps than I would in the 3-on-3 prep, because it's about getting on the same page with the other person. Any questions on prep for an opening half team? All right. Let's look at the role of the closing half team, and this is where things start to get a little bit different in the debates. So, the roles are actually really quite simple. Members present the extensions. Whips defend the extensions. An extension is the key thing here. So what is an extension in a debate? We covered this briefly, but I'll go into a bit more detail here. An extension is anything you say in your speech. That could be arguments, rebuttal, framing, context, examples, whatever. Basically, your speech is the extension. The question is the amount of newness in that speech. So when a judge says you didn't have an extension, or the other team says you didn't have an extension, well, the other team says that they're probably lying, but if the judge says it to you in feedback, what they actually mean is you didn't have stuff that was new, or you didn't explain why your material was really relevant or new or important in the debate. So you've got to make sure you explain and point out to the judge, what is this material that is new? What am I calling my extension, and why is it different, and why does it matter in the debate? And then you assess on the relevant newness. So when you're being compared to your opening half team, what judges on panels will do is they'll say, well, opening government, for example, made these contributions. CG made these contributions. Contribution 1 was the same as opening government. We'll knock that out. So we'll now just compare contributions 2 and 3 to what opening governments are and see which was better. So anything you say beyond what your opening has said is what is considered like the relevant and considered part of your extension. So what does an extension need to do? It needs to present a novel contribution to the debate, something new rebuttal, new characterization, new argument, whatever it is. And secondly, it needs to prove itself to be the most important thing in the debate. Impacts more people, is logically prior to the opening's argument, so the opening can't occur without you, has a bigger impact on like the scale of impact as opposed to like number of people or whatever, or is it from a principle, whatever it is, something that make it more important, the judge should care about it more than the other side. That's the basic role of closing half. Let's look at some approaches to closing half then. The first way, I think there's two big ones and then there's two smaller ones that kind of fit in both the big ones. The first is horizontal. That is where you run an argument that is entirely different to your opening's arguments. Your opening arguments will run arguments over here, you're going to move horizontally over here and run an entirely different argument. So new stakeholder, new impact, new causation, whatever it is. What's the pro of this? It's definitely new. It is a brand new argument that you can't be accused of being derivative if it's an entirely new concept. So if opening government talks about why dogs are good and you at closing half talk about why cats are shit, then that is a new contribution. The problem is here, sometimes it can be hard to prove how important it is or how relevant it is, and maybe it will be low impact, because sometimes you can have a brand new argument, but if your opening has already taken all the obvious arguments, it can be hard to prove that this new thing is the best or most important thing in the debate, so you have to do a bit more work there. So when do you use this? This is good to use when your opening team has left you space. So when they've done a deep dive strategy like we talked about earlier, so that you have a new thing you can talk about over here, or when your opening has just missed any key information, so they've just really missed an obvious argument or missed a key piece of setup or something like that that you can really dive into and expand on and explain. So that's the first thing, horizontal extension. If you've got one, probably the better form of extension to run. The second way is to look at vertical extensions. I'm really glad people got the visual gag. So a vertical extension is where you take an argument your opening half has run, but then they haven't run it very well, or they've missed key parts of the argument, and then you extend it vertically. So they said this, we're going to add these things to it that actually make the argument work. So focus on a new stakeholder, new mechanisms that prove the idea better, new examples that help illustrate it or apply in the same argument in new context and explain why that context is good, or better, more important, but you're adding something to what the opening has already run. The benefit of this is if you're successful in proving it and successful in adding new things, you will likely get above your opening team because you've done what they've done, but better than what they have overall. And it also means you directly clash with opening opposition's rebuttal. So opening opposition will generally attack, I'm using CG as the example here, but obviously it works for CO2. So if opening opposition attacks what opening government has said, and then your argument advances the opening government's claim significantly, it probably skips over and beats the rebuttal that OO has said too. So it can be a useful way to knock out both top half teams, because OO is only responding to the OG's version of that case. And also it's hopefully quite relevant to the debate as well if the opening government's already talked about it. The con here is, will it be a deep enough extension? Because some judges are particularly critical of how deep an extension has to be. And you'll notice, especially when you go to like Worlds, the judges from different circles have a very different level of tolerance for amount of newness and how much they will credit it. And it's really hard to pick at times between judges. I tend to have a pretty reasonably high threshold. So you can't just be like, there are 4 reasons why this thing is true, and the 4th one is the new one. Well, I'm probably going to believe your opening because they've already given me 3 pretty good ones to believe that you have why this thing is true. So you've got to make sure you have a genuinely new contribution to make there. So when do you use this one? You use it when your opening half team has left you no new arguments to say, so has scorched the earth. So when you've got nothing left to do, you want to run this argument to try and explain why you just build off what they have said. And again, if we talked about scorched earth earlier, you're now capitalizing upon the risk that your opening has taken by picking that approach. So when you think about closing half approaches, think about what their opening half partner is. If you identify what the opening half has done, that'll help you lead you to what should I do in closing half to be able to get above them in the debate. I think the other thing with vertical extensions is if you've just got nothing else to say, like if you just don't know what to do, you've run out of arguments, like you're not going to go to jail if you just say what your opening team has said again, but try and claim that it's new or try and claim that it's different. The most important thing, particularly when you're new at BP debating, is just get up there and say something, and then over time with practice you'll get better at saying new and different things. But just get up there, call an extension, and just do what your opening did. That is okay. Like you're not going to go to jail. You'll just get 0 points, and you'll be fine. Maybe you'll get 3rd. You never know. Like there's always a worse debating thing. Excuse me. So those are the 2 big ones. Those are the 2 smaller ways to think about closing half. The first is to find a hole in the opening half. I don't know if anyone's seen this video, but it's the funniest video on the internet. So this can be used whether you think it's both vertical or horizontal. So what you're trying to do here is find a missing hole in the top half of the debate. So some piece of information, a piece of setup, a stakeholder, a weighing or a mechanism or something the opening half has just missed. And your idea is to fill in the gaps and then explain why nothing that happens in opening half makes any sense without the thing that you have said and why that thing is so important. And that means that like often a judge who's like also picked up this thing is missing is going to be deeply frustrated sitting there like, when is this claim going to come? Well, this makes sense until I hear this. But that missing link can be particularly important. And it allows you to take some degree of credit for what the other teams have said in the debate as well, because you can be like, well, now we actually action their outcomes, which means we get credit for those things occurring. Judges have how much a judge buys it really depends bearing on your judge. So that's the con. It has to be really important. Otherwise, you'll be punished for not being particularly new enough. Like you can't just add one additional mechanism. You've got to add the magic missing mechanism for this sort of thing to work. And I guess to use an example of this from a high school debate I saw the other day, it was 3-on-3, but I think the example makes a lot of sense. It was a debate about building public housing in wealthy suburbs. And the negative team had a whole lot of arguments about how it doesn't matter where poor people, like low SES people live, they'll still be like targeted and abused and not get jobs, etc. But never at any point explaining their case why once you move into a wealthy suburb, everyone will know that you're low SES and know that you live in the public housing. And those things may seem intuitive, but none of the negative team's harms made sense until someone made that mechanism. So that was a BP debate, and closing half gets up here and explains why you'll still be known to be in that person. They will probably get ahead of their opening in that debate. Maybe, depends on other factors in the debate, but it would be a good way to fill the gap that makes all the arguments make sense. Does that make sense to all you guys? Okay. The other approach to closing half is just rebuttal. So that is just where you're just rebutting the other teams entirely and not really making what we'd call a new substantive contribution, but you're still making an extension contribution by just rebutting other teams. So the pro here is it can be a great way to knock out your diagonal opening and your opposite closing if you just take them down and leave them with nothing left standing. But the con here is that without a substantive contribution, some judges may not like you or may not be willing to get you over your opening half team. So, and there's also the risk that rebuttal can be derivative as well if you're just rebutting the same things that your opening half has said in rebuttal. So when you use rebuttal extensions, I think this is quite similar to what we said about deputy earlier. is that if you don't have any new arguments, and or you woke up and chose violence and just want to attack the other team and just take them down in the debate. This could be a useful strategy in some out rounds, because in out rounds, the top 2 teams go through. So if you can strategically be like, all right, we're not going to beat our opening, so let's just spend the rest of this whole extension beating the other 2 closing teams, you might tactically make that choice to run rebuttal in those cases. This is probably more of a last resort kind of approach to extensions, but is still in and of itself a valid way to approach extensions of just saying I'm going to rebut everything the other team says. Let's look at a more specific strategy about speakers then. We will talk about both members and whips in this speech, unlike when we talk about opening half. So the member, the government member or the opposition member, similar to first negative, I think is the best comparison for both government and opposition speakers, because you do have the capacity to do rebuttal, and you also have a case to deliver. The same thing applies as with any first negative speech though, is you should prioritise getting your extension out there in the debate over any rebuttal. So you have some really killer rebuttal to say if you're a Gov member, you might have some really cool rebuttal you want to get out to OO because they've been stupid. Hold that instinct, unless it forms a part of your extension, default to doing the extension. Get the case out there that you want to win the debate on and save that rebuttal for later in your speech or for the whip speech. You want to get the case out there as your priority. Because quite often you get carried away with 3-4 minutes of rebuttal and then you've got to take a POI and all of a sudden you're at 5 minutes, you've got 2 minutes left to run your extension and you don't have enough time then to get the new material out in the debate. And that's the specific BP concerns. You want to make sure the extension is the priority. It should come out ahead of any rebuttal. And in terms of the language you use, make it sound new. So my first point in extension will be, the new thing we are adding here is, this new contribution is important because some judges, I kid you not, anyone who's judged or debated at Worlds will tell you, are fucking dumb at times. So just hearing the word extension and new a lot will convince them it's a new extension. Jimmy Stratton, he's going to come up again in this presentation actually. He judged Worlds one year and then realised that with these panellists, that if a speaker at the end of their speech said, and the 3 things we told you in extension were 1, 2, and 3 really clearly, and he'd ask a panellist, what was the contribution or why did you move to this thing? The panellist would go, oh, well, their extension was 1, 2, 3, and say exactly what the summary had been. So actually the language sounds that it is really good and really useful for trying to sell yourself, to sell an idea to your judge. In terms of POIs for members then, the government member should take from closing opposition as a priority. Any reasons for why you want to take from, if you're a government member, why you want to take from CO as a priority? Dan?
You get a chance to more directly engage with ORO anyway, so right after them, but you kind of want to position the extension in such a way it's taken into account CO, so ideally you POI CO and CO reveals at least the glimpse of what they're arguing, because it's right before.
Exactly, yeah. So as Dan said, exactly right. You want to make sure that you get the extension out of CO, engage them a bit clearer, because you have the opportunity to directly rebut OO, but you have got only one speech to attack CO.
But one follow-up question I have to that is, would you swap that around at the point in which it's really clear that ORO is like taking a massive crack on OG opening half? Like if ORO is so clearly the team coming first in the debate, is it not more useful than engage with ORO really explicitly? Because it's going to be very hard to see over them anyway.
I think in those cases where you think OO is the biggest threat in the debate and is smashed OG and you think CO is not as big a threat, probably useful to then take OO in that case to try and have a crack at them or to give them a test or a chance to attack your case and show why it's resilient to them. So I think in those cases it would work, but I reckon it's a general default where you're not sure where the debate's kind of even, you should try and take from CO. Too easy then. And then as opposition member, you take from whoever really, because you have the chance to directly respond to everybody. I generally reckon you should take from OG, because you let them have a crack at your case early, and then you have more attacks at your direct closing later on. But really take from whoever you want to at that point, because you're directly responding to the Gov member, and you can also respond to OG. But I think as Gov member, as a default, more important to take from CO. Let's look at some whip strategy then. So let's look at first at similarities to 3-on-3 speakers. The whip speech is kind of a mix between a third speaker and also I would say a reply speaker as well, using the Australs format, because you need to whip and summarise and defend your extension to explain why it wins the debate and why it stands up to things. But you also need to do the meta work. And what we mean by meta work is like approaching it like a judge, so explaining why it wins the debate, how it weighs against other arguments, etc. Like you would do in a reply speech, where you explain to the judge why your case has won the debate, as opposed to just being a rebuttal machine at third, where you take down the other side's approach. So what are specific things about BP that you need to be careful of with whip speeches? One, you want to cheerlead. You want to be the person that gets up there and shows why your extension has won the debate. You want to lead with it, you want to integrate it, responses. So you want to integrate your responses with your extension. So like there are 4 reasons why CEO's extension is wrong in this debate. The first 3 are things we told you in our extension or something, things like that, to make it clear that your extension doesn't just sit on the side as a different part of the debate, but actually is really integrated with the rest of the debate and beats everything else out. Secondly, you also want to go on the attack. If you're at GovWhip, you are the only speaker in the debate that gets a chance to respond to the CEO extension. So in that case, you probably do have to prioritize, if they've got a good and new extension, rebutting it and knocking it out of the debate. And where you can explain why your extension beats their extension, but you've got to think tactically, they've got a case here, is going to be important, you need to go at them. Question?
No, I guess like more of a comment.
Yeah.
I think the one thing as well that's useful that like a lot of people forget is that CEO also is another speaker, right? So even if like, the extension doesn't make sense, it's a little bit silly, you should still respond to it, because if you don't, then CEO will just get up and make you look silly.
Absolutely.
Like I remember distinctly, it happened in one of our Princeton debates. Galwood spends all their time responding to us and opening up position, doesn't give a single word to CEO. CEO take it first because they get no response to their extension and just out-threatening everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to summarise it in case the audio here doesn't pick it up.
Yeah.
But Dan's exactly right that if like the extension is not clear at CO or is a bit like you think silly or not really very good, there's always the risk that the member will make it better. So the whip speaker will make it better. So you do want to respond to it as charitably and with as like the best format as possible to make sure you knock it out. Otherwise, it just leads them to having a bigger chance to beat you later on. The other thing here is you've only got 7 minutes, which is a chronically little amount of time, particularly when you've got to take a POI, and that probably knocks out 45 seconds to a minute of your speech if it's a particularly important or big POI, which leaves you with 6 minutes left. So you've got to make sure, it's often a question more of what you cut out than what you put in, so you have to try and think about what is the actually going to win us this debate here. Is it promoting our extension, defending it, tactic decide, and thinking about what do I need to prioritise? So thinking critically about that is particularly important. In general, though, you should target your biggest threats if you are worried you'll lose the debate to a certain team, or your most likely victims, for want of much better phrasing. But if you think you are like, we're not going to get first, but we can really have a shot at second or at third, let's try and knock out these teams. Or sometimes, very legitimate strategy, done it many times myself, where you're just gunning for the third, or what's it called? The slinging for the sausage? What's the word?
Soliciting the sausage.
Soliciting the sausage, fanging for a frankfurt, whatever it is. Where you're just like, I'm going to put this team in fourth. I'm going to put them in the bin. So you want to target that team really heavily. So think about what your approach is going to be to how you want to win the debate, and given that strategy will help you assist in what I need to put in and what I need to take out. And you've got to do the meta work. You've got to weigh it, you've got to describe how it interacts with the rest of the debate and why it's so important in the debate. We're actually going to take a moment here to actually look at a few common scenarios you'll face as a whip speaker. The problem with whip speakers is there's like an infinite amount of variables that would change how you'd approach that speech. Here I think are 5 really common things that'll happen to you before you give your whip speech and how you should generally try and respond to them. The first thing is, if your extension has been completely clobbered, you've been beaten down and knocked out, is it recoverable? If you think that extension is still recoverable and can win the debate, you should lead with it and spend the time right at the start of your speech explaining why it still wins the debate, why it beats out that rebuttal, and as a part of that process, explain how it beats each claim. So our first point of our extension was this. Their rebuttal was this. We beat that rebuttal because that means we beat them. That means we beat this team. That means we beat our opening. And explain why now you've re-won that extension, why it beats the other teams. If it's beyond repair, if it's just gone, pivot. Rebut the other team, massage the truth of what happened to an extension, make it sound like you said something you didn't say, or it was better than what you said originally at member, but try and focus on other elements of the debate if you no longer think that after that speech your extension can win the debate overall. If your opposition closing doesn't have an extension, as I said, similar to Dan, what Dan said earlier, you probably shouldn't just completely ignore it because there is a risk it gets better at the whip speech. But you want to call out the fact they haven't given anything new. That this is derivative, that was something the opening said, doesn't actually matter here. But then you might want to prioritise your other teams or your own extension in that case to try and improve other parts of the debate if you're really confident that the other closing team doesn't have extension, isn't going to be a threat. If your opening is really strong and they're your biggest threat, so like we've knocked out the opposition bench, but it's our opening that's the problem, if you can beat them, if you think you've got them, show why your extension is more important. So in this case, you're focusing more on the weighing of like, well, we made this claim, opening government made this claim, at closing government we presented this new claim and extension. Here's why this is more important than your opening. If you're their closing team because they've closed the door behind you and you can't beat them. That one didn't work as well. Fight for the second. So pretend they aren't there and just engage on beating the other teams in the debate and trying to get that second speaker thing. The fourth one is your extension hasn't really come out clearly yet, member. If that happens, that sometimes happens, things go wrong, speeches aren't always great, you might have disagreement. Lead with it. You want to re-explain that extension, but you re-explain it as if it's like obviously always been that way. In the same way we talked about earlier about like massaging the truth. Re-explain it in a way that defends it against rebuttal and make it look good. You don't get up there and say, well, remember cook this, let's start again. No. Our member smashed this debate. Let's remind you of what they said so compellingly in their speaker, and then give the better version of it, the full version of it, right? So if it hasn't come out clearly, if you still think it's winning, just do it again. And if your extension has smashed it, and it hasn't been responded to at all and still stands, that's great. What that means is you don't need to spend very much time re-explaining the extension. What you need to focus on is pointing out how it wins the debate, because the judge already has the unresponded to notes on what it is, but here's how it wins the debate. And then you just move on to rebuttal. The thing with all of these is it's important again because there's so much happening in a VP debate, but if you can put a label and a name to what's going on, that will help you develop the strategy and approach what you want to do in that speech and what you want to prioritize. But there could be like a million combinations of like variables of what teams are doing and how teams are working. But I hope that gives you some basic sort of approach to think strategically about what I want to do with that group speech. Any questions? All right, let's look at POI strategy in the closing half then. Again, keep asking every 15 seconds. You're allowed to, it's legal, you won't go to jail. But you will go to jail if you don't accept any POIs though, like POI jail straight away. All right, no one laughs at that. So, during your opening half, what you should be doing as a closing half team with POIs is don't give away your extension. Don't get up there and go like, my extension is this, what do you think? Because that gives teams the chance to rebut you and other teams can prep their rebuttal to you and you give everything away. This is the second part where Jimmy Stratton becomes relevant in this debate, as he was one of the world's best debaters of his generation and probably one of the best of all time. He used to do this frustratingly talented thing where he'd be at like whatever member position and he'd get up and pick, he could be an opposition member and PM would be speaking, minute 30, and he'd get up and go, our extension will be X, Y, and Z, how do you respond? And he'd still win the debate despite giving away his extension 25 minutes early. Unless you are that goated, hide it. Don't give it away. I think it's okay if you're government member, closing government, to give away your extension to the deputy opposition leader, because you're only talking about 2 or 3 minutes difference here, but it does give them a chance to engage and a chance for you to attack that engagement as well. That's kind of the only exception to the rule. What you should be doing then is going to be useful to asking questions that don't give away your extension immediately, but kind of like traps that then become relevant to your extension later on. So you ask a question that seemingly isn't connected, but then you make it relevant later in your extension. But what you mainly want to do with your POIs and your closing half team to your opening half is focusing on rebuttal. So trying to attack what they're saying, so then you get a bit of a head start on the rebuttal. You do less rebuttal in your speech because you've already done it in your POIs. Red herrings can also be fun, just asking a POI that is just totally irrelevant to your case or to the debate, because it just means you chew up time in the other team's speech, but don't give away any harm to your own case. I guess the funniest extreme with that example, we did a debate once where we were closing a position. I think Brendan and Bree were judging me in this debate. And it was about having Olympics where athletes were allowed to be like augmented with drugs and with technology and stuff like that. And the POI was just, isn't going to be a massive safety risk to people in the audience when the javelin throwers get really strong and overshoot the edge of the mark? And that's a nothing POI, right? That's not going to win us the debate. But it took us 15 seconds to ask, it took us 10 seconds to 15 seconds for the other team to make fun of it and say it wasn't relevant, and that was 30 seconds of the other team's speech gone. And it didn't impact us in the end. I think we still came third or fourth, but not because of the fun POI, because of the shallow debate and everything to say. So, did you set it? Oh, sorry, I forgot that you were CA. I think we had fun. All right. So during closing half though, what do you want to do with your POIs? So you're POIing your opposite closing team. You want to push your extension. You want to be continually selling your extension of like, why didn't you respond to this claim? Or this extension, our extension beats your claim because of X, Y, Z. You may also want to ask about their extension. This is a question more for the judge than it is for the other team. One of those classic POIs is, hey, this has been a great 4 minutes of case, but I'm wondering if you're going to get to your extension at any point. You try and put the burden on them or make it seem like they haven't said anything new. Again, there's a line between being funny and being a dickhead, so don't cross that line. But you can point out that something is derivative, or point out something isn't new, to try and point to those meta questions in the judge's head, and put the burden back on the speaker then, because they have to explain and answer that question to show whether their attention is new or there.
Those are the coolest POIs, I think.
Yeah.
I remember at Worlds doing it, because I remember doing it because there was an American team who genuinely hadn't made, it wasn't, I didn't know what their benefit was. They were CG, I had no idea. And I wanted to know so I could write it down. So I was just like, what's your benefit? And then the guy was like, and they got really upset. Waste like a minute of his speech, so I guess that is a benefit.
Yeah. The one of the things I think fits in the category of like cruel, but kind of like necessary and good, because it is a fair claim to ask. And the last thing you do is just rebuttal. So it's just like, if there's something particularly useful, if there's like a newer version of the extension or a better version of the extension coming out of whip, where you just want to attack the other team's extension by using rebuttal in that POI. Does that make sense? I think actually, I've noticed here on POIs generally, think of POIs not just as ways to attack the other team, but also as things you want the judge to be aware of. They're as much about the judge as they are the other team. You'll even notice a bunch of teams at Worlds, rather than addressing the POI to the speaker over there, they'll just face the judge. I find that deeply annoying because I'm not part of the debate. But some teams will try and do it because they're asking them to talk to the judge about it. All right, let's look at prep time for closing half teams. There's still only got 15 minutes. Actually, you don't. You have more because you have all of the opening half to prep as well. So think about your case as being 15 minutes of prep without anyone else, and then 25 additional minutes of prep with other people in the room. So for the prep, just start like normal, as you would any other prep. List the most obvious arguments, list the most likely model, and the most important things to debate. And these are obvious because they're generally good, they're generally relevant, and you want to run them if your opening doesn't. So if your opening doesn't run the most obvious argument in the debate, that's great. That is mission accomplished because then you can run the obvious argument. The judge can go, oh, thank God. OO can go, damn it, we can't respond. And then you can win the debate. So always run the obvious stuff. Once you've got the obvious arguments jotted down and what they are, you then want to start thinking outside the box. What is the second tier argument? Is there a different stakeholder we're not considering? Is there something new or a different element we can look at? If we put this debate away from the first world and into the developing world, would that change the context of the debate? And start thinking a bit broader. Once you've got all those ideas and discussed them, you want to rank your ideas. So prioritize what we want to run first to what we want to run last. And in a normal debate, your top 3 ideas will get taken by your opening team. So as your opening says an argument that you've got written down, you cross it out, and then whatever's left, you then write out in full and start running as a case. Question?
One thing I think that's often useful as well is just like, because you don't have to immediately give your speech to closing, you don't have more time to think. Often means you can like be like, oh, this is one of the best 3 arguments today. There's no way that like opening will come up with this. And you usually find out quickly. So you can often like pre-commit to writing an extension just because they're unlikely to come up with it.
Yeah, absolutely. If you've got that out of the box cracker idea, that's when you can start like writing it out in advance and getting ready for it. I think for a lot of newer debaters, that light bulb won't always come. So I think it's useful in those cases. It's more important that your teammate and you are on the same page of, if we run this argument, what is it going to be? What does it look like? How does it work? So that you're across the idea. So that like because you won't have time and capacity to talk on the bench because you can't talk very loudly. You also be listening to what the other team has to say. So you want to come out of closing half. The generally rough idea of like, these are the arguments we want to run. If we run this one, it does this. If we run this one, it does that. Does that make sense? And just cross off down that list. Oh, Brenda.
When it comes to generating extensions, an important thing to keep in mind is that anytime someone is writing a case, the premises of the arguments that they're running, of those premises, the ones that feel the most obvious are the ones they often under-explain. So when you're on closing half, it's really good to look at the list of arguments you wrote for opening half, and then examine kind of like what needs to be true in order for this claim to work, and then think, is it actually true? Are there other reasons it might be true or might not be true? Because often explaining those foundational premises can be valuable ways to find extensions. A good example of this, and the kind of canonical one in my head, is I remember watching a seminar by a debater who was talking about a debate that was like that we should teach nationalism in schools or something like that. And the debate was basically, should schools be a place where people learn about their national identity or develop a sense of patriotism? And the debate was like that we should not, or something, I don't know, we should not have it. And so opening government get up and they're like, nationalism is really bad. Here's 5 million reasons why. Blah 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 blah. And then opening opposition get up and say, no, nationalism is awesome. It's super cool. Very 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 good. And a lot of opening halves end up this way. There'll be something in the topic, and then opening government are like, it's bad. Whatever, depending on what side they are, like, it's all bad. And the opening is like, no, it's good. And then they just kind of clash about it for a while. And what closing government did in a debate-winning move was just ask, are schools good at teaching nationalism and good at teaching national identity, right? And then they just were able to kind of win the debate because it had been an unspoken premise in opening half. Neither team had examined because they were too busy thinking about nationalism and the really big ideas contained therein. They had been too busy focused on that to think, are schools actually, like, how does it actually get taught? Are schools good at teaching it, etc.? And closing government were able to win quite handily on that basis. They also get to say fun phrases like, we'll be the first team to take you inside the classroom or whatever, like stupid branding that people use for their extensions. But the important, the thing that they did was, right, is that they looked at the topic, they looked at the core, like really basic arguments that both open government and open opposition are basically compelled to run, right? Because you'd be insane. Because that's the other thing, when you're an open government, like, there are certain arguments you're like, I'm a little idiot if I don't run that, so I've got to run it, right? So they run that, and there's often the premise that feels most obvious, that feels the most clear, like the thing that seems really intuitive and simple, is the thing you actually under-explain, right? Or goes unquestioned. And if it's obvious enough, and especially if the debate has like other really cool and fun and sexy things in it, like nationalism, like the oathing teams get drawn like a moth to the flame to the big idea, and they miss the kind of core premise. So it's just a really, really simple way of generating extensions is just to look really, really carefully at what the big ideas opening up and opening opposition run. See if you can find something that they're not likely to prove, but might actually be very important, and then spend a lot of time either breaking that premise or constructing it, depending on your regard or whatever the debate is.
Exactly right. That's a perfect example of that missing link thing we were talking about, where if we prove this thing, everything else actually becomes relevant in the debate. I guess a similar one that Uday and I had at Worlds in our Octo final that I think the judges got wrong. It was about having a cynical or a positive view of government institutions, what was better for society. And OG was like, cynical bad, or cynical great, like optimism bad, and Neg Op was like, no, optimism good, cynicism bad. And we're like, oh, we don't give a shit. What matters is how people respond to it. So when your populace thinks this way, here's what institutions do differently. And that, I think, in both those examples kind of sidesteps the opening half clash and makes you more, in my opinion, more relevant. The judge's opinion, solid third. Anyway, not bitter or nothing. But yeah, so exactly right. But you have that discussion in prep about what you think needs to be proved, and that light bulb comes on. If they haven't done that, great way to approach doing it. Last general tips then, before we wrap up. BP is not just about proving the logical truth of arguments. It is so much more about proving the importance and the relevance and the why we care about these claims. And you have to be the most important team in the room. So it's never too early or too late to filtrate or to weigh and impact your arguments. No one got that right. No, it's a TV ad. The leaders should do it at the time if they have time, but sometimes it can be useful to leave that to deputy to do. So the Prime Minister just gets out there and just gives 8 minutes of case, or 7 minutes of case, and Deputy Prime Minister gets out there and explains why we care about that 8 minutes of case. And often people will talk about just closings, needing to weigh their extension and needing to prove their extension is important, but it's harder for them to do that if their opening has already given you a bunch of weighing to believe that their case is good, because rather than starting from zero, you've got to knock something down from being important to putting yourself up as more important. And that goes back to what we were saying earlier about what Brendan said, and what Joe Ashcroft and a few New Zealanders really promote is thinking about opening half like closing half. What's the thing we need to do? What's most important? Let's prove it really, really well, and let's weigh it as being the most important from the start. The other thing is framing is super important here. This is where you explain to the judges where your arguments fit in the debate and what they're doing for the debate. And this is especially important and a lot easier for closing half teams to do. So whether I'm thinking member or whip and I'll have an argument, what I often do, and I've started trying to do this a lot more, is be like, we're going to raise, especially if so first point of extension today will be proving that, to use Brendan's example earlier, that schools will actually be good at teaching nationalism. This will beat opening half because of X, Y, Z reason. So you tell the judge why you're making that argument happen so they know what it's doing in the debate rather than just leaving it up to the judge to figure out where it connects. So frame what your extension does. Our second point of extension will prove this. This is particularly important because it knocks out CO's extension or whatever it is. to give the framing and the debate of why you care about it. And lastly, this presentation is lots of information, but at the end of the day, debating is just doing the basics really, really well. So go in, focus on the basics, have some fun and give it a go, and these strategies and things will pick up and grow with time. All right. Are there any questions before we wrap up?
I have some comments.
Yeah, go for it, Brendan. Do you want to come in front of the camera?
Sure. So I was just taking some notes throughout, so I just have some thoughts on BP strategy. The first, there are like 4-ish. The first thought is that an underrated thing to focus on, especially when you're new to BP, is to focus on beating the other team in your half, right? And the reason it's important to focus on this is because it means that if you are able to be successful at this, you will not get the fourth, which is very important in BP. Because if you're going to a tournament, and especially if the tournament, let's just say, the tournament is a weekend mini competition, where there are 5 or so in rounds, if you get a fourth, it's like really hard for you to break. It's really hard for you to make the finals. But if you can kind of get a third and scrape a third in a situation where you might otherwise have gotten a fourth, that can really help you do better, right? So there is a big difference between getting no points and getting 1 point, and you get no points if you get a fourth. So focusing on the other team in your half is really good. I think this is especially true for whips, where you want to be just like, I don't know, my preferred whip strategy, at least when I last did whip, was to be like, here's what we beat the other team in our closing half. So you lock in, in the first half of your speech, the judge feels pretty confident that you're better than the other closing half team, and so you've definitely got at least a third. And then you can try and win by trying to get over the opening half teams, if that makes sense. And in opening half too, like at DLO or at DPM, it's like very good to be like, to be able to at least give the edge at kind of the conclusion, or maybe 2/3 of the way through your speech, the feeling that you have won opening half and your team is ahead. And then because then it depends, sort of the rest of the debate kind of comes what may. Like maybe there's nothing in closing half, and you beating opening half actually means you just win the debate. Maybe both closing half teams are better than you and you get a third. A little unlikely. What usually happens is you get around a second, right? If you can beat the other team in your half, it is like, I don't know the exact numbers, but I would suspect that you end up often getting seconds, which is really, really good. In BP, you want to be collecting seconds. You want to hoover them up, right? Because they're 2 points, and if you get consistent seconds, you're a very good chance of breaking in pretty much any tournament. Right? So focus on being the other team in your half, because it means you don't get a fourth, and it often means you end up getting like a third, right? Just because of the way the ability is distributed. The second thought I had, just to go back to opening half a bit, was that in pretty much every case I've ever seen, even by people who are extremely good at debating, there is something missing. Like there is a problem. And this is especially true when you have 15 minutes to write the case, as you do an opening. So you should go in as deputy expecting and kind of ready and waiting to be filling in whatever was missed in your, because there will be. There's hopefully we don't miss anything. You will definitely miss something. You'll definitely miss something. So go in with the expectation that you'll miss, that your leader will miss something, and then kind of be ready to fill in the gaps. I remember being at a tournament where I watched a team and the PM kind of made a lot of contribution to the debate, but didn't actually prove a really important part of the case. Didn't actually prove at all a really important part of the case. And the case was maybe 2 minutes away from being potentially debate winning, and deputy didn't, ignored that and just went on the attack, and they end up third or fourth, I forget, right? So it's a problem if you, a deputy, don't realise the issue in the case, because it can be the difference, especially in opening government, between getting a first or a second or a third or a fourth. So make sure that a deputy, you're really listening to whatever, and it is always at least one, usually more case errors, you forgot to explain one premise, you've got to impact another premise, you've got to there's always some kind of issue. The third thing is just on the idea between the deep dive and the scorched earth, I think of that kind of as a bit of a continuum, which is to say, as you get better at debating, you can get better, can't approach doing both. You get better at being able to do both. Getting better at debating is in my opinion, is being able to explain and be persuasive with shorter and shorter intervals of time, right? Like a good debater is someone who takes 1 minute to explain an argument where it would have taken the average debater 2 or 3 minutes, right? Like someone who can do that is really, really good at debating. So the trick is like, the better you get at debating, the more you can run scorched earth, but each of those arguments is very well proven and almost like a deep dive, yeah? So the better you get, the more returns there are to that. I do think though, there's often a benefit to the deep dive for younger debaters, and just like, to be honest, I think all debaters, but I think especially when you're starting out, just because it's really simple, like if you pick one impact and then you just like really prove the hell out of it, it's rare if you get a fourth, which again, very important, avoid getting fourths. And I think finally, yeah, like all arguments, and often like the way that teams are positioned relative to each other should be thought of in terms of whatever impact they're trying to claim, right? So like imagine like a motion that's like, Taiwan should like try and become closer with China, right? It should engage in rapprochement with China. Opening government might make the claim that this is important because if they fail to do this, the probability of invasion from China is meaningfully larger, or some kind of claim like that, or commenting on the plausibility of that. If that were the case, then opening government's claim is like, the whole case, everything they're about is just like, does the probability of war with China go down as a result of this policy? Like that's everything it hinges on, right? Maybe closing government takes the approach of this would be really good for Taiwan's economy, and that's like really important. And their case is then all entirely hinges on the impact of like, do the standards of living in Taiwan, I don't know, over the next 15 to 20 years, like increase by some kind of meaningful or noticeable amount, right? It's really useful when you're like, for example, Op Whip in that debate or Gov Whip in that debate, to like sort of think about the teams really in terms of their impacts. Most of the time, a team can often be condensed to like 1 or 2 actual impacts they're trying to claim. And that's why I like, yeah, so that kind of deep dive approach where you pick one impact and just really relentlessly go after it. It's a really good way because it kind of helps condition you into thinking about debates and think about arguments in general as like through a very ruthless impact-focused lens. Like, and in fact, and I'll kind of stop talking in a second. In fact, like, as Rob would know, having been to Worlds a couple of times, one of the things you really notice, because Worlds is very stressful, one of the things you really notice after you've been there for 2 or 3 days and you're on your 8th or 9th debate in the space of kind of 72 hours or whatever it is, you really notice how all that matters are impacts. Like you really notice that like nothing else matters. That's why, like, for example, when you're like, I asked that POI of that American guy, admittedly that wasn't day 1 of Worlds, but I asked the POI because he was spouting the debate was about trade policy, and he was spouting some kind of principled nonsense about how like, it was like, didn't make any sense, it was garbled American nothingness. And I was like, bro, I need, give me, what's your impact? I need to know what it is so I can rebut it, right? So I can provide counter material. And then he like got mad because he didn't have anything. Which, I don't know, it's like the definition of a skill issue, I suppose. But I think when you're writing cases and when you're thinking about, especially when you're like, I don't know, especially where, but also all of this debate, like thinking really relentlessly and very ruthlessly about like, what's the impact, like what's the big picture, like what's the impact I'm proving here? Does the risk of war go up? Does the amount of violent crime go down? Like, be very, to a certain extent, it's very literal in terms of what's going on, which is maybe, I don't know, in a philosophical sense, maybe like some kind of deficit to debating. But I think most of the time you're going to be really impact focused. Like a good example, I think one of the things that prompted our discussion about like that deep dive approach, especially from OG, is that debate that was like, the Catholic Church should allow women to become priests, or that as the Catholic Church you would allow women to, or something like that, or allow priests to marry, or something like that. And I had the good fortune of like being raised a Catholic, knowing Catholic, so I just knew things about it. But I had the good fortune of also thinking that all that really mattered in the debate was if you could increase the number of priests, that was like the biggest benefit, because the Catholic Church was running out of priests, right? Well, that's so the framing goes, right? And you just, like that case is just like, step 1, prove why lack of priests is very, 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 very bad. And then step 2, prove this increased number of priests. And then step 3, take POIs and then weigh everything else out in the debate and be like, that's not, that like, the other team gets up and they're like, oh, this contradicts doctrine. You're like, it doesn't matter. Like, what contradicts doctrine more is not having any priests, so go away, right? Like, and then, you kind of take POIs and you sort of work with the other teams in the debate. And often you end up winning because if you properly, and this is true, I think it's actually, I used to think it was just true for extensions, and I also kind of think it's true for opening half as well. If you just like, here's why what we have to say is really, 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 really important, and then here's why it's really, 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 really true, It's hard. You know, that's a very, very solid strategy. So kind of doing it, impacting your framing first, a lot of the time, is like really useful. I would argue for all debating. I've kind of become a bit of a convert to this, I suppose. But especially in BP, right? Because there's so much going on. The ad also sometimes enters into like impact kind of hunting mode. They only want to hear about like what this actually means for like what's your actual impact? Like just get everything else out of the way. Like what do you say? You're saying this will go up, you're saying that will go down, you're saying this will happen, that will happen. What is it? Tell me it first. I want to know what it is. You know, it's probably somewhat, they probably understand why they probably should care about it. You can do a lot of work to explain why they should care about it relative to other things, and then it's just about proving that you've got that thing. But yeah, leading with impacts and being really impact focused would be my big kind of, I guess, advice to PP. Yeah, anyway, that's all I have.
Awesome.
Thank you, Brendan. Any other questions for Brendan or I? All right, thank you very much for taking it, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it.